In this section, I'm going to talk about human consciousness. And most people find that pretty fascinating. Perhaps it's the thing that most makes us feel unique as individuals, our internal experiences of images that can include things we've seen in the past, things we've never seen, things that don't even or couldn't exist. Sometimes it seems even more vivid than what we can perceive through our senses. And the question I want to look at today, though, is how can we understand what's happening in terms of brain anatomy, physiology, and chemistry? And at this point in the course, most of the time I can stay at relatively high levels of description because we've established the way to map descriptions of the type I'll be using down to the more detailed levels. So what I'm going to do is identify some specific cognitive phenomena that are generally regarded as conscious, and also some that are generally regarded as unconscious, and then look at the different brain processes that support these phenomena. So what are the cognitive processes we label conscious? And right at the start of modern psychology, one process was identified as being very characteristic. Let's suppose you're out on a hike, and as you walk, you see the scenery, your fellow hikers, and you feel your body as it moves. But in parallel with these direct sensory images, there can be a stream of imaginary visual and verbal images flowing on in our heads, a bit like a movie which may have a very weak connection with our immediate experiences. On the hike, it could be images of our destination, or what we were doing last week, or some future plan. Often in this mental stream, we experience sharp images or words separated by periods in which the images are much more vague or fuzzy. And while it's going on, we can talk about this internal succession of mental images and even in some cases remember it and describe it later. A striking part of this mental stream is that it can include images of ourselves. For example, we can imagine ourselves doing all sorts of different things. But even beyond that, we often have a sense that there's someone there inside, and this someone is ourselves. And we can even observe our imaginary self as if we were on the outside, watching ourselves carrying out some task. Even more remarkably, there can be conversations between our current self and this mental self-image. We can discuss things with ourselves, ask ourselves what to do, have a conversation with ourselves. What should I do about that? Another aspect of consciousness is the vividness of experience. If we're on that hike, we may briefly notice a tree. Even without paying much attention, we might say, oh, there's a tree, and avoid walking into it. But if we choose to focus our attention on the tree, we can have a much more vivid subjective experience. Although, beyond just saying it's more vivid, it's actually very hard to describe the experience in any detail. This can be true even looking at a simple colour. A glance is enough for us to identify the colour red. But again, if we focus our attention on it, we can get a much more vivid experience. But again, it's hard to say exactly what we're experiencing, beyond saying it's red and it's more vivid. And an interesting question is this experience the same every time we look at the colour? Or is it different every time? And is it the same for different people? There have been all sorts of attempts to study this aspect of human consciousness, getting people to try to verbalize their experiences. Sometimes people say it's like inner speech, sometimes visual images, sometimes it seems much more vague. And a lot of people report experiencing periods of vague experience punctuated by sharper images. And sometimes we can imagine multiple independent streams of images going on at the same time. And the question's often asked, what's it for? There's lots of very complex things we can do without being conscious of doing them. We can play musical instruments, looking at the music, moving our fingers, while our consciousness is focused on the audience, or the emotions created by the music perhaps. We can learn some things without being aware of either learning or doing them. A lot of social behaviours, for example, like how far we stay away from the other person in a conversation, or how we avoid bumping into other people when walking in the street. There are social conventions, signals we use, and we're often not aware of these unless they're pointed out. And some of the highest creative capabilities are unconscious. There's a famous story of the mathematician Poincaré, who, out of the blue, with no prior thinking he was aware of, suddenly had the insight that two mathematical approaches were identical, Fuchsian functions and non-Euclidean geometry, in fact. And he was later able to confirm this insight, but that required conscious studies. So some of what we regard as very high human cognitive capabilities don't even need consciousness. To give a more prosaic example, many of us have perhaps experienced driving a familiar route, and afterwards realizing that we've no memory of driving. We must have been barely aware of what we were doing, and it's left no imprint in our memory. Our consciousness was somewhere else altogether. And if we're very skilled at some physical activity like archery, then if we consciously think about what we're doing, we don't perform as well. So consciousness actually interferes with effective behavior in some cases. And if we need to make a major decision, like whether to take a new job, we may think about it consciously for a long time. The thinking is conscious, but we find it hard to verbally describe what happened at the instant the decision was made. What processes were going on? Now, early on in the course, I talked about dichotic listening experiments in the lab, studying the influence of behavior on behavior of sensory information that isn't consciously available. In these experiments, different texts are read to the left and the right ears of a subject using headphones, and they're asked to repeat out loud the text presented to one specific ear. And afterwards, the subject can remember the repeated text, but has no memory whatever of the other text. So that other text wasn't available to consciousness. The interesting thing is that if partway through you switch texts between ears, subjects continue to repeat the meaningful continuation, unaware that they're now attending to the other ear. The key point here is that although no information from the unattended ear was entering consciousness, that information was nevertheless able to influence behavior, as demonstrated by the switch. So I plan to talk about the 4 topics I've introduced in terms of understanding them in terms of anatomy and physiology: the stream of mental images, self-awareness, the vividness of conscious experiences, sometimes these experiences are called qualia, and the difference between conscious and unconscious processing, although the topics won't be covered in this order. So remember, the objective is to describe conscious experiences in terms of relatively high information processes that are approximate to some degree, but we know how to map them to more precise anatomical, physiological, and chemical processes if required.